Subject this morning, live for God alone. Live for God alone. Why? Why should we live for God alone? We must know the reasons. In the first place, Jesus said, as we will remember, lay up treasures, not on earth, but in heaven, for the simple reason that those treasures laid up in outward or worldly consciousness do not last. They pass away. But those treasures laid up in the eternal consciousness of God will not pass away. As His consciousness is eternal, so whatever effort you give to lay up treasures in that eternal consciousness will not pass away. Jesus also said, seek first the kingdom of heaven, or that consciousness of God in which all things exist. Seek first that, and all other things shall be added unto you. Not a few other things. All other things that you need. But it is so difficult to see beyond this delusion that if we seek God alone and know Him, receive His bliss and joy, all other things will fit in and work in as they should to our best good, that His will be done. The Master said also, God alone. He once told me as he formed this organization over the many years, with its heartaches and trials and tribulations, he had plenty. He said, if it were not for God alone, I would not have been able to preserve my sanity, and I can understand it. He alone built this without anything when he first started. Built it, suffered. Why? For you and for me. That we have a way whereby we could know God alone and be free from suffering and know the bliss of God. He often said, my life has been a ransom for many. But I know that from the omniscient consciousness of God, as He knows what is going on and as He sees and feels the hearts of all of us, how thankful we are that He did leave this way for us, that He is well pleased. Because every true saint is one with God's great omniscience, a ray of the great eternal light of God, as our Master is. And so, let us realize we need God alone, because only God alone can give us our heart's desire to be free from pain and suffering eternally. That's what we really want. You can reduce it in any way you like. It comes right back to that. You want to escape pain and suffering, not just for a week or two or a year, eternally. And that's God. Ever-conscious, blissful, eternal existence is God. That's what you want. That's God alone. That's the reason why we should live for God alone. Now, there are two kinds of living. There's ordinary living and living for God alone. In ordinary living, we live with a consciousness that has a birth. When we were born, then we began to build up this consciousness which we use in ordinary living. Worldly consciousness, outward consciousness of duality. And that had a beginning, that must pass away. Everything that is born must pass away. Now what has happened? What has happened is this, that our soul, which is the consciousness of God in us, has become attached to that duality of consciousness, that outward consciousness. And being attached to that, when that outward vehicle passes away, when the consciousness of this body is finished, the soul being attached to it also passes into unconsciousness, oblivion. Why? Because it knew nothing but the duality of consciousness which had a birth and will pass away. Now that's what happens in ordinary living. But when we live for God alone, then our consciousness is or rather supersedes this outward passing, changing consciousness, and is one with the eternal consciousness that did not have birth with your body. Always was and always will be. That's God Himself. Now, when you know that consciousness, by living for God alone, make that your own, supersede transient, changing consciousness. When you do that, then your consciousness does not pass away with death. If in this life, by following the channel of God as our Master, who left the ways and the means, if you follow that sincerely and give a moderate amount of effort, God does the rest. He lifts you up so that you supersede outward consciousness and know that eternal consciousness which always was and always will be. Now, these things are not mystical, so to speak, mysterious, I should say. If you will practice the techniques which the Master has left, you will find them to be true. If you do not practice, I can talk from now till next year, you'll feel the same. But if you take these things, try them, experience it, then you will know, and not until. As St. Paul said, I die daily, means that he practiced conscious death. That is, he obliterated his outward consciousness. He attained a breathless state, and by so doing he knew that one eternal consciousness which did not pass away. Now we can do this, but you can't do it by sitting and doing nothing. You must discipline yourself. But there's one wonderful thing, as we read in Daniel, 10th chapter, 12th verse. This is most wonderful. The moment that you set your heart, Daniel, fear not. The moment you set your heart to understand this eternal consciousness, and then do something about it, or discipline yourself, I am come for your words. And so, let us not be discouraged. Let us start, and then having started, let us continue with the spiritual discipline of regular devotion to God, a regular amount of meditation to God, and soon or later we will find what we want, God alone. Because the moment we open the channel by setting our heart and realizing we need God alone, nothing else, the moment we do that, the channel is open. Then, if you give a moderate amount of time even, God is very good. If you really want Him, that's the main thing. Then if you give even a moderate amount of time, He takes you and lifts you up so that you supersede this consciousness of delusion and know the real consciousness behind all things. Remember that chapter. The moment you set your heart to understand God alone, not live ordinarily in worldly consciousness which passes away, but you realize, Father, there's something beyond this worldly consciousness. I need Thee. I must have Thee. The moment you set your heart to understand and then do something about it, God says, I am come for those words. That means the channel is open, and you will know Him as God alone. So we should take heart and realize the Master has left a wonderful path for us, each one of us. It is not too difficult. But if He had not come and sacrificed and given His life for many, it would not have been so easy. That's spiritual law. Just like in my own profession or yours or your business. If someone else hadn't done it before you, it would be difficult, wouldn't it? But we take advantage, so to speak, of those who've gone before. So we take advantage of what the Master has done. He's opened the channel. Keep it open, and you will know God alone. Now, in ordinary living, as I have said, we follow outward consciousness. But in living for God alone, we follow not the little self, not this little personality or ego, but we follow the greater self, or God. Therefore, in living for God alone, we live a life of renunciation. Now, renunciation is not what it always seems. It doesn't mean that you have to go to a monastery and be incarcerated, so to speak, in that monastery. No, Master said self-realization is the path between monasticism and worldly living. Now we have monastic living. It's wonderful for those who can do that. Not all can. God is not narrow. God is broad. Both are necessary. Both are a part of this great work of self-realization. But I think as most of you are out in the world, I am speaking to you at this time. You can, even in the outer world, live a life of renunciation or live for God alone without too much difficulty, if you really want to do it. Now, a life of renunciation is what? It is this. When you live, you work for God. You don't work for your little self. You work for everyone, the good of all. You work for God alone. And when you are not working, you are performing the yoga of action, which simply means you are meditating on God. Now that's renunciation. It doesn't say anything about race, color, creed, married or single. It says that when you are doing your ordinary work, whatever it is, you work for God alone. Feel Him in every action. Take Him with you. And when you're not working, you're giving as much time as possible to meditating on God. That's called yoga of action. Yoga means union. Now, by these two things, renunciation of the fruits of action, plus the positive work of meditating upon God, what happens? You know God alone. Now, that's what renunciation is. So you folks who are in the world, realize that you can be true renunciates if you do those two simple things. These are the Master's words. They're not mine. That was his definition of a man of renunciation. And so, because when I went to see him the first night back in 1920 in Boston, Christmas Eve, I hear some of you have been hearing stories about it. That's all right. I stayed out a little too late. When I returned, things began to happen. Nevertheless, what I received offset what happened. So, on that first night, when I met the Master, I was very skeptical, but he showed me the definite things of the spiritual eye and other things. So what could I do but say, that's right. But then I said to myself, how can I, with a family, a wife and 2 children, how can I run off to the hills? I could, but I wouldn't. He says, 'tisn't necessary at all. One of the greatest saints of our line of saints was the great Larry DeMasha, a family man with wife and 2 children, and he attained great heights. So I said, that's wonderful. So each and every one of us can, even if we are in the world, remember that we can attain God. And that's what we want, whether we are in living a life of full renunciation, like some of our members do, or whether we are living a life of renunciation in the world. What is the result? The result is union with God. Not just living the life in either place. Union with God is what we want, God alone. Now going on just a little bit further, what are we seeking in this life? I touched this just a moment ago. There's one thing you want, one thing I want, and I don't deny it. I want to be free from pain and suffering. And you cannot look at it in any other way. You say, oh, if I had $1 million, I'd be free from everything. You'd just begin to get into trouble. Blessed be nothing. These are facts. But if you can have God come on with the $1 million, they can do lots of good with it. And so that's what we want. Great Patanjali said, tear out the cause of suffering by the roots. And what is it? It is attachment of the soul to the body. If we can break that attachment, that's where all the pain comes, isn't it? If you practice your exercises and yoga, and you can rise above bodily consciousness, you can cut your finger off or anything, you won't feel it. But you got to be able to do it. Rather inject a little Novocaine, it's much easier. But it can be done. And those who practice regularly will feel the life force withdrawn from the body into the spinal region. These are facts. And the body will feel cold. But you won't die at all. You'll be fully conscious. It's like St. Paul was. I die daily. And so we have to do that. And remember what we are trying, why we want God alone, what we are really seeking is to be free from suffering. Not just for today or tomorrow, eternally. And that's why God is ever conscious, blissful, eternal existent. And if you have that, then you have God alone. Having that, you are free from suffering. And that's the goal of life. To be free forever from suffering and pain. Now we have a reference here I'd like to give at this time. Jesus' words, seek first the kingdom of God. Because he knew that if you did that, attain God alone, you would be free from suffering eternally. And so it says in Matthew, the 22nd chapter, 37th verse. It says as follows, thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, and with all thy mind. Why? Because only then will you attain him, and only then will you attain fulfillment of all desire. That's why that's the first commandment. The second is thou shalt love thy neighbor. If you know God alone, you will see him in the hearts of everyone, then you can love them. But not seeing that is rather difficult, especially if they're not doing right. But when you see God in the hearts, then, as Jesus said, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. So you can, but you can do it only when you see God in the hearts of all. And that's why the first commandment is the greatest. Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy strength, with all thy soul and thy might. God alone is the supreme existence, and that's why we must know him. Know him first. That's what Jesus had in mind. Seek first the kingdom of heaven, and all other things shall be added unto you. Now going on just a little bit further, we want to live for God alone because everything came from one eternal substance. And that one eternal substance is God. Now, all other things pass away. All other things change. And so you can understand that we must live for God alone, that we supersede this outward consciousness which changes. We see it every day. People come. Where are your grandparents? Some are living, but most of them have gone. Where are mine? Gone. But there's something that was in them that didn't pass away. The one eternal substance from which all things come is God. That didn't pass away. So, every consciousness divorced from that one eternal substance of God, one eternal consciousness, will pass away. Now, this outward consciousness is divorced from that. You know that, I know that. The things that happen in the world are not of God, a lot of them. What has happened? That consciousness has been divorced. Every consciousness that is separated from God will pass away. And so it behooves us to supersede this duality of consciousness into the one eternal consciousness of God, eternal substance, from which all things come and which will not pass away. In St. John, the 8th chapter, 51st verse, we read as follows, Verily I say unto you, if a man keep my saying, if a man lift up the Son of Man, supersede this Son of Man, which seems so real. If a man keep my saying, he shall never see death. If you can supersede this consciousness and know the eternal consciousness of God alone, you will never die. Now, this is not just imagination. If you follow the techniques given by a Son of God, as the Master was, you will be able to live above this worldly consciousness of duality without breath. I don't say he's a little bit off. No. Many have done it in this room. You will live without breath, and you will know that you are immortal by that fact. St. Paul said, I die daily. St. Paul passed into the breathless state. So can each and every one of us who practices with sincerity and love for God in his or her heart. They will feel the breathless state and be fully conscious. Now, if you can do that, you know you are immortal. That's why we must know this one eternal substance which is above all things. Also, we have another reference in Revelation, the 2nd chapter, 10th and 11th verses. Be thou faithful unto death, and I will give thee a crown of life. Be thou faithful in your meditations and devotions unto the death of worldly consciousness. That's all. And you will know the consciousness of life, which is eternal, God alone. And finally, in the 11th verse, he that overcometh shall not be hurt of the second death. Now, these things have a meaning. If you meditate regularly, reach the breathless stage, never again will that state of death bother you. Because when you have to cast off this vehicle, you'll be used to that state, having practiced it by following the techniques which the Master has left, that technique where you practice death consciously. Then death can never touch you again. Don't you think we need to live for God alone? We must know that consciousness. We must attain it. And so finally, in conclusion, remember this. We came alone with God. Who came with you when you were born, little baby? You don't remember that. Neither do I. But underneath was that one consciousness of God. To say the great saints, remember, through death, in the mother, and out again. It can be done. I feel that. So that one eternal presence of God was there. So when we came alone with God. The Master said, I came alone with God. I don't want to take anything from India or America with me when I leave, because I will go with God alone. Why not know Him? Why not let's go in a conscious way with God, not just in an unconscious way? Every night in sleep we go back to God. How many are conscious of it? But we go there just the same. Now you can know God in a conscious way. You can practice so that when death comes there'll be no sting to it. You'll be familiar with it. Why? Because we are children of God made in His image. So we came with God alone. We go with God alone. But let's make it in a conscious way. Why not? Let's not be animals or slaves. We are children of God, made in His image, and He has given us the power to do that. Let's go in a conscious way. God has given us the ways and the means whereby we can do that and know it. I wouldn't stand here and tell you unless I, in my own consciousness, know it can be done. There's too much of that in the world, of this and that, traveling in the astral and all that business. How many can do it? Very few. You have to know God alone, then you can do it. He does it. You don't do it. And so we have the ways and the means of knowing God alone. I want to close by reading from the Bhagavad Gita, a passage which is most beautiful and sums up the whole picture of why you must know God alone, you must live for Him, why I must live for God alone. is most beautiful. On page 15, we read as follows. Realize, each and every one of us must realize that God the Father, at once Lord and Law, thou shalt have no other gods before me, is the doer, working out the mighty evolution that ends in peace and bliss. God is love. Now He is doing the whole thing, although He seems so distant. But if you look within and feel in your heart, you will feel His love there. God loves us, the Master says, more than we love Him. We don't realize that. He wants us to come back, but we are so sidetracked and deluded. And so we read that this mighty evolution ends in bliss and peace. Be identified with Him by devotion. Know God alone, that's what it means. And then perform duty as duty, without attachment. We all have a job to do. I have one. You all have a job. Do it without attachment to it, keeping God with you in every action. That's what it means. Perform duty as duty, without attachment. And thus activity forges no bonds. There's no attachment. It's the attachment to things that is bad. The soul becomes attached and we suffer. But if you perform the action as it has been pointed out, without attachment, activity forges no bonds. Yoga or union with God is accomplished and the soul is free. These are the words of an ancient scripture. You read in our Bible the same thing. And so we must do that. We must know God as the soul doer and what responsibility it takes off of your shoulders. Really, give it to God. That's what we must do. Live for God alone. And as He is supreme, all fulfillment is in His great love. Every desire that you can imagine He will grant to you if you live for Him alone. Don't you think we need to live for God alone? I think so. This is February 12th, Lincoln's birthday. There was one of the greatest Americans. And I know each and every one of you know he lived for God alone. Because he could not have felt and carried out the things which he did, of giving freedom to everybody, irrespective of color, race, or creed, unless he felt God alone. He was a very humble man. Why? Because knowing God alone, he realized that he as an ego or a personality amounted to nothing. That's what Lincoln felt. If he had not felt that, he could not have been the great Lincoln. And so as he and many others lived for God alone and performed the greatest service by so doing, let us, no matter what our station is in life, great or little, let us live for God alone. God alone.